Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us again today as we hear from God's Word and as we worship together. And at this point in our sermon series on exile, we're in phase 2, as it were. We're moving into the book of Daniel. Jeremiah kind of laid the groundwork, prepared us for exile. We kind of talked about what exile is, why that was something that happened to God's people. Now, as we turn to Daniel, we're going to look at how people can live in this state of exile, in a strange land, as it were, in an unfamiliar place, and what that means, how you can hopefully not just survive, but actually thrive. And so that's where we are now. We'll be there probably for the majority of the rest of the summer months. And I know we're kind of in this strange in-between space as well as churches everywhere, but our congregation as well, right? We're trying to figure out what does it look like now that churches can begin to reopen in our province, and yet that's not quite as straightforward as we might want it to be. And in our case, it's a bit even more uniquely complicated because we rent the facility we use and for reasons such as that. So we're trying to figure all of this out. The sort of exile continues, at least for the short term. But as Daniel and his companions find out, this doesn't have to be the end of the story. God can still do some pretty amazing things, even in some unexpected places. And that's what we're going to look at today. One of the interesting conversations I had near the beginning of this whole COVID thing was about how our society right now, we really don't have a frame of reference for large-scale hardship, actual hardship. Early on, back in March, there were a lot of comparisons between the coronavirus pandemic and, the world wars or Spanish influenza in 1918 and 19. And back in March, we really didn't know what we were facing with this whole thing at all. We know a bit more now. On the one hand, we know that Spanish flu, which had nothing to do with Spain. Spain was neutral in World War I, and they were one of the few countries that actually reported on this flu outbreak, and that's how it got to be called Spanish flu. Really didn't originate there, wasn't more severe there than anywhere else, just they reported it sooner. We know, though, that pandemic killed around 50 million people worldwide in 1918 and into 1919. Could have been even more. They don't know how many died in some places. But just so we're clear, COVID-19 has killed about but getting close to 500,000 people. That's about 1% of the Spanish flu pandemic. And the world in 1918, the population was about a quarter of what it is now. That hopefully just puts some things in perspective about the kind of hardships and tragedy on a massive scale that previous generations faced that we really can't fathom. I mean, and there are a few of you that might be in this category. If you're more than, say, 85 years old, you might remember some of the great hardships that happened, World War II, growing up in the Great Depression, that kind of thing. But most of us can't even begin to fathom what it was like to live through the First World War and then face down a global pandemic that killed more people than the war did. Most of us can't imagine what it was like to live through the Great Depression, the dirty 30s, and just barely get through that, and then have World War II happen. We just don't have a frame of reference because we've had it so good for most of the later part of the 20th century and now up until 2020. Now, of course, we should be thankful that we have it so good. We really should, and I am thankful. But one of the unfortunate side effects of having it good, and this is just one, but it means that when we do find things to complain about, they often end up being pretty trivial things, right? Bad service in a restaurant, slow internet, my investment portfolio lost a little bit of money. These are issues of preference and issues of convenience. And I think that, for the first time there actually is something threatening, and we don't exactly know what to do with it. It's one of the things that struck me powerfully as I began exploring the book of Daniel over the last couple of weeks, and especially this first chapter. Now, Daniel and people like him, they did know what some real hardship looked like, right? These young men, Daniel and his 3 companions, and we know there were others, they were taken away from their homes, their families, taken into captivity in a strange land where everything was completely different. Everything they knew was gone, right? And this was just the beginning of what Jerusalem and the nation of Judah was going to face. These were genuine hardships. And yet, even though all these things happen to them, they're placed with a hostile foreign power, they complain very, very little. Very little. Now, we're going to learn a lot about Daniel and his companions as we spend the next few weeks with them. Now, the first half of the book of Daniel, it consists of some pretty well-known stories, probably things you learned in Sunday school. VeggieTales has done versions of some of these stories, right? But that's not where these stories end. These are stories of immense power and testimony to the power of God, the sovereignty of God, the goodness of God. They teach us how to live and serve God faithfully in a world that both looks different than anything we've known before, and a world that's either indifferent or even hostile to our faith. So we're going to be spending some time with Daniel. I warn you, today's message, because we have some introductory stuff here, it's going to be a little longer. Okay, Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1. We'll read the whole chapter here. It's all pretty important. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuch gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigns your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord. So, there's an important thing that we really need to understand if we're going to make sense of where we are in this whole story of God. We are looking at the book of Daniel after we've looked at the book of Jeremiah, right? And Daniel is in exile. So in our brains, we might be thinking the events that happen here in these opening chapters of the book of Daniel happen after the things we've already talked about in Jeremiah. But that's not how this works. I'll explain this in a minute. What we're learning here about Daniel, at least in these early chapters, this happens at the same time as many of the events we've just heard and learned about during the ministry of Jeremiah. Now, I know this might be a bit hard to understand, so let's get a timeline up here and we'll look at that again. In the year 605, or thereabouts, Nebuchadnezzar won a major battle against Egypt. It seems that at that time, he also came back through Judah on his way back to Babylon and staked his claim there. Now, a lot of translations have something like he besieged Jerusalem, but it could also just be translated that he threatened Jerusalem or he blockaded Jerusalem, rather than laying an actual formal siege against the city with the intention of taking it. And at this time, he also deposed Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, and he took some captives, or hostages, you might say. Now remember, the city of Jerusalem isn't going to fall to the Babylonians for another 20 years or so. This is just kind of an initial threat that Nebuchadnezzar made. There was this small deportation just from the upper of the upper classes from Judean society, of which Daniel and his friends were a part. Then there was another major deportation in 597, and then 10 years after that, the city eventually fell in 587. So right, we're backing up in history from where we left off with Jeremiah. Daniel is part of this initial deportation, this very first one, which would have been small and consisted of some young men from the nobility, the royal connections, possibly some from the priestly classes. These represent the brightest and best of Judah's elite. Now, we didn't have a graduation ceremony this year for the high school or the college or seminary, but in normal times, part of a graduation ceremony, and we do this every year here, involves reading the names of the students who receive honors. And typically, with their academic robes, they'll wear a gold braid to signify that they are honor students and have won awards. Now, these are the kind of individuals that Nebuchadnezzar's officials would have rounded up and taken off. They were on the lookout for the very best, the brightest, the most skilled, and so on they went. But most people were not part of this group. Most people were left back in the land. Most people would have assumed that this was it, and that this would all just blow over very soon. At this point, Jeremiah was only just kind of getting started in his ministry, telling people, warning them in fact, that no, much worse was to come. Okay, so hopefully we've got some clarity on how this fits together. I hope the timeline chart here is helpful. Daniel and his friends are in exile, but it's a very early stage of exile that consists of only a very small number of people. More people will join them in exile as time goes on. The events of these opening chapters of Daniel take place alongside what we've already read about in Jeremiah, rather than after them. They're just happening in two different places. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar has besieged or blockaded the city. He's laid tribute on it in some form. And one of the things he's done, he's confiscated some of the treasures from the temple of the Lord. The vessels, it says, this is going to be important later, he took them back to his temple, the temple of his God in Babylon. It actually says that he took them back to the land of Shinar and placed them in the temple of his God. Now that's interesting and it's important Shinar is an archaic name for Babylon. The last time we heard this name used for this region of the world, you might remember, maybe you don't, if you're very familiar with the Bible, it's mentioned in the book of Genesis, when people come together in the land of Shinar to build a tower that goes all the way up to heaven, a tower that was called Babel. That was like old Babylon. But here there's a connection, right? This might be new Babylon, centuries later, but it's the same old story. That same root of this sinful and prideful desire is still there, this desire to live in rebellion against God. And yet, one of the themes that we looked at so much in Jeremiah was that God was sovereign in all of these things. Even though Babylon was a wicked empire that stood in opposition to God, it says here that God gave King Jehoiakim and this treasure even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Now from Jeremiah, we've looked at a number of times already. We know that the way God gave over his people into judgment, into exile, was because they broke his covenant. Not much is said here about the people breaking God's covenant. We'll get there eventually in Daniel chapter 9. But remember this phrase, God gave. It's going to be very important as we look at the rest of our passage for today. So Daniel and some other young men from Judah are taken back to Babylon. Now this must have been earth-shaking for them. These were likely young men, maybe still in their late teens possibly. There's no FaceTime or Skype or anything back then. It's likely that these guys never saw their families ever again. And another thing, their Babylonian masters gave them new names. Right? Another attempt to cut them off from their heritage and their identity and replace that with a Babylonian identity. Daniel becomes Belteshazzar, Hananiah becomes Shadrach, Mishael becomes Meshach, and Azariah becomes Abednego. It's very significant. And maybe some of you do come from a family who adopted an English name when your ancestors came to Canada. For instance, a German immigrant might have changed his name from Johann Müller to John Miller. However, that's still the same name as far as meaning goes. It's just how you would say the same name in a different language. But what happens to these men is much deeper. It's not just that their names are the Babylonian equivalent of what their names were. Most Bible characters have a name that says something about the Lord. You might have noticed these men all have names which end in El or Yah, which refer to Elohim or Yahweh, the names of God. And those names are taken away from them, and they're given names, that include such things as Bel or Nego or Nebo, for instance. These are names of Babylonian gods. So these young men have their names which say something about their religion and their connection to the Lord, and those names are taken away, and they're given names that refer to pagan gods, Babylonian gods instead. Their very identities are changed. I mean, imagine if you were given a name like Buddha is the way, or Muhammad is the true prophet, and that's what you had to answer to from now on, and that's how you had to sign all your correspondence with. Imagine what that might do to your identity and how you thought about yourself. And yet, this doesn't seem to be something that they have any ability to change. I mean, maybe amongst themselves, they go on calling themselves by the Hebrew names they grew up with, but publicly, they can't do that anymore. And they just kind of cope with it seems, and get on with their lives. Another thing we learn about them is that they are educated in all the literature of Babylon. Okay, a couple of things here. First of all, there's a significant language barrier there. Now, the everyday language of Babylon, like much of this part of the ancient world at this time, was Aramaic. It's a closely related language to Hebrew. It used the same alphabet as Hebrew. Most of them probably already understood Aramaic, even if they weren't fluent in it. A large portion of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic. It might be comparable to say that Hebrew and Aramaic were a bit like, say, Italian and Spanish. Now, different languages, but similar enough that they're readily learnable one to another. right? Similar languages. However, Babylonian literature and its history and so forth was written in Old Akkadian, which was a much more challenging language, especially in its written form, because it wasn't an alphabetic language like Hebrew or Greek or Latin, which has a couple of dozen letters in an alphabet. It was a more pictographic language. It had hundreds of symbols, and these symbols looked remarkably similar to one another. So just learning the language in order to read the literature would have been quite a difficult endeavor for these exiles from Judah. But the content of that literature would have been even more objectionable to Israelites, because the majority of the texts that they would have been learning would have centered around the Babylonian religion. These would have included the religious sagas about the Babylonian gods. And that's bad enough. But I mean, at least they could have said there that they were just learning about these things. But these texts would have also included instructions in sorcery and divination. And those were things that they wouldn't have just been learning about. They would have been expected to learn how to perform these rituals and practice them. And that was strictly forbidden in God's law. And yet again, it seems that there's not really a whole lot that they can do about this, so they accept it as their lot. If they must learn these things, they will do so. But it seems abundantly clear from what we're about to read that they decided they'd learn them if they had to, but they were not going to believe in them. I mean, that would be so hard to keep those separate when you're just soaking this in and day out. They were part of a process that was expressly designed to convert them from being Israelites to being Babylonian. Okay, so they've accepted quite a lot, actually, which I think would be pretty hard for most of us to swallow. But what do they not accept? Well, as we're going to see, there are some things that they are not willing to swallow, quite literally. It says that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the food and the wine that the king provided. So what's this all about? Well, it's actually kind of hard to know. Right away, you might think, particularly of the meat not being from clean animals, maybe. We know that the Babylonians ate all kinds of things, pigs and horses even, which were not acceptable for Jewish people to eat. Certainly their meat wouldn't have been slaughtered likely in a kosher fashion. But that would explain not wanting to partake of meat and eat vegetables instead. That wouldn't exactly explain why they wouldn't partake of the wine, though. Wine was never really regulated in the Jewish law at all, except in the case of a Nazirite who would abstain from wine for a season. Perhaps there were concerns that the food had been ceremonially offered to an idol in the temple. That was a thing that happened all over the ancient world. It was probably the case here. But even there again, the meat probably would have been offered to an idol, but the grain and the vegetables likely would have been offered in an idol temple as well, or at least it's certainly possible. Some have proposed that by eating this food, Daniel would have been declaring solidarity with the king. And this is emphasized in the text, that this is the king's food, the food from the king's table, and he's giving it, he's sharing it with these men that are exiles. And so there's a sense, right, that accepting food it had a lot stronger connotations in an ancient culture than it does for us. But the text really never comes right out and says kind of what's the deal with defiling himself. It seems that these Jewish men kind of live apart from the Babylonians as well, so the king is not going to know whether they're partaking of his food or not, and so not partaking is not really accomplishing a whole lot as far as, as proclaiming that we will not be part of your project or what you're trying to do. It's a bit of a puzzle, but it seems, at any rate, that Daniel believes that to eat his food would be defiling in some sense, and so he decides that he and his friends won't eat it. It might simply be that they saw this as just at least one small area where they could resist in some fashion, and so they took it, even though it was a very small thing, something at least that they could do. Now remember when I mentioned we should tuck that phrase God gave away. Well, here it comes out again. God gave Daniel and his friends favor and compassion with the officer in charge of them. Just as God was sovereign in giving the nation of Judah over to judgment, over into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar, so he was also sovereign in protecting these young men who wanted to stay faithful to him in spite of very challenging circumstances. God was at work behind the scenes. God is always at work behind the scenes. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes in His grace, He gives us at least a little opportunity to see what He's up to. But it's interesting, right? The text goes out of its way to say that God was gracious to them. He gave them favor and compassion. And then we get this interesting little story about how Daniel has to do this little bit of clever negotiating to kind of work this deal out. So even there, while God is sovereign over this situation, they still have to act with wisdom and discretion and with courage. Because the officer in charge doesn't want to initially go along with their request to just eat the vegetables and drink water. He seems sympathetic, but he doesn't want to get into trouble. If these four don't measure up in terms of their health and their appearance, he, the captain of the guard there, he's going to get held responsible for why they're not measuring up. And I think it says when he would be endangering his head, he means that quite literally. As we're going to find out, Nebuchadnezzar has quite the appetite for eliminating people who stand in his way or who do not please him. So the higher officer, they don't necessarily get anywhere with him. So then Daniel goes to the next guy down the chain, the steward, who actually brings them the food, presumably on a regular basis, maybe daily. And so with this guy, Daniel and his friends arrange this little 10-day trial period where they're just not going to eat the rich food. They're just going to eat vegetables and drink water. And then after 10 days, they can be evaluated and see whether they look okay, whether it's had any ill effects. And maybe this steward just goes along with that because he's going to eat the nicer food and drink the wine that they're not eating, and so he doesn't think it's such a bad idea. Who knows? But at the end of the 10 days, you all know the story. Their health has not gone backwards. They look just as good as everybody else and even better, and so they commit to this diet for the remainder of their education, which lasted 3 years. And at the end of that time, they stand before King Nebuchadnezzar, and once again, they're found to be the very best in terms of all their learning and their skill, and as well in terms of their appearance. In fact, the king finds them 10 times better than all his homegrown magicians and scholars. Why is this? Well, again, God gave. It says God gave them learning and wisdom and skill in all that they had to study and to learn. And specifically for Daniel, God gave him, it says, a unique ability to understand dreams and visions. And this will come up again and again throughout the rest of this book. And then chapter 1 ends with what we might be tempted to see as just kind of a little throwaway line. Daniel was there until the reign of King Cyrus. But that's not a throwaway line. Cyrus is the Persian king who defeated Babylon. This last line is actually crucial for the whole setup of the rest of the book. Things might look dire now. Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant, and they're trying to figure out how they prosper under such a reign. Here's the thing. Even though things look dire now, Daniel is going to outlast the current reality and the current regime because God is with him. When Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire as an entity is long gone, Daniel is still there, and God is still prospering him. So we're going to see this as the book goes along. But what do we make of Daniel and his friends and they're not eating the food and just sticking to eating vegetables? Okay, couple red herrings here to avoid. Not long ago, this passage was commandeered into the service of a fad diet program called the Daniel Plan. Eat vegetables and drink water, it said, and you too can have a flawless appearance and be wise and successful just like Daniel. Now, the truth is, many of us probably could do with eating a few more vegetables, and I don't know if some of you might enjoy wine, some of you it might not be your thing. Maybe water instead of Coca-Cola wouldn't do you any harm, though. It wouldn't be a bad idea, but that's not the point of this passage. The fact that Daniel and his friends were healthy and fit and strong after eating this diet, that wasn't really the point. The reason they were avoiding this food was because they didn't want to defile themselves in some sort of a ceremonial or clean, unclean fashion. It wasn't that they were on a diet program to lose weight or get fit. Okay, a longer time ago, but similar idea, this passage was a favorite with the temperance or prohibition movement because Daniel and his friends abstained from wine. And that's where that old song, maybe some of you who are further along in years might remember, Dare to be a Daniel. It became popular at temperance movements and during the Prohibition era. Except to borrow from the words of the song, Daniel was not exactly standing alone. He actually had 3 really good friends standing with him. And while he did have a purpose sure, he kind of actually kept it to himself, or at least these friends just kept it amongst themselves rather than making it known. So, it's not just the case that Daniel didn't eat stuff, and so we should apply this in our own lives by a specific diet today. It's deeper than that. Here's the thing, and to return to where I started. I'm sure Daniel and his friends were terribly grieved and even badly traumatized by what happened to them here, right? Separated from their families, taken away from their homes, their culture. And again, remember how important the land was in the ancient Israelite understanding of God's dealings with them and how he ran the world and everything. Forced to learn and speak a new language, given new names, forced to study and almost certainly participate in pagan rituals and religion and occult ceremonies, all kinds of stuff like that. I'm sure that privately, amongst themselves, they must have grieved deeply, even bitterly, for all that they had lost and left behind and would never see again. And yet, they don't do a whole lot of complaining either. They don't do the thing where they get all demanding of their rights. They don't even seem to petition God or demand of God that he delivers them. They just get on with living their lives as much as they can with the wisdom God supplies in this weird and upside down space as strangers in this strange land. That blows my mind. I guess if I'm honest, I'm rather scandalized by how far they're willing to go and what they're willing to accept, and also a bit puzzled, initially at least, by what they decided to resist. And I guess at the end of the day, this text doesn't provide us with an easy roadmap about how to live in a time of exile, right? It's not a checklist of do this, don't do that, for sure don't do that. What it does tell us is that it's possible to survive and even to thrive in an exile situation, in an upside down time where things don't make sense, where our surroundings are different than what we were accustomed to. Here's a few things I think we can take from this story, and some are positive and some are negative, but hopefully we can find, as all of you listening to this, some things that will resonate with you. Maybe the Lord, by His Spirit, will put on your hearts as things you should think about and apply in your own lives. Okay, number 1, wasting time complaining will probably not help. In our situation, whether it's about COVID-19 or the larger cultural moment we find ourselves in, there's not much point in complaining about our lot in the world, let alone the many things so many Christians complain about within their own circles, right? The old stereotypical ones, the temperature in the worship space, the length of the sermon, the number of songs, the type of songs, the volume of the songs, how people dress for worship. Complaining about those things is not typically advancing God's purposes in the world very much. Certainly, it's not really putting our energy and our effort into living as God's people and as He would have us live. Now, grieve what is wrong and evil in this world and what is lost for sure, but complaining or the kind of self-righteous scolding that some Christians have tended to engage in, that's not what's going to help our cause in this time that we're living in. Number 2, band together as you are able to do. These young men from Judah, they left behind all the typical religious supports they would have been accustomed to, right? The worship services at the temple, and those could be spectacular. The sacrificial rites and ceremonies and their festivals and all that entailed. They left it all behind. Now here's the thing. These were not the only 4 young men from Judah that would have been part of this exile. We know that there were others. It says as much. These 3, though, they stuck together, or these 3 plus Daniel, so these 4, they stuck together to support one another when their familiar supports were no longer available. As I just said, there must have been others who did not do this, who just assimilated completely into Babylonian society, or at least more or less did so, and their names are lost. They're not mentioned in history or in the scriptures. Now, as we are not able to worship and to do ministry as we've been accustomed to, even if that's just for a season, support one another in smaller settings as you're able. Encourage one another in your faith, pray together, practice accountability, spend some time in God's Word, right? Don't let this be an isolating time any more than it needs to do. Even just walking about town, when you see your brothers and sisters, do more than just make small talk. Really inquire about one another's well-being and how you're doing. Spend some time praying together. All of these little things, they add up and they really do matter. And they will be important things that help to see us through this season that we are in. Now, number 3, resist where you can, even if it's just privately. Daniel and his friends, they didn't make a big deal about what they were doing. As far as we know, it was only the steward that brought them the food and they themselves that even knew that they were engaging in this type of resistance. If they had had social media back in that time, I don't think Daniel and his friends would have been taking pictures of the vegetables they were eating and then posting it on their social media and, using this as some kind of a protest against what Babylon was trying to do to them. It seemed like for them, this was more something for themselves in order to maintain their own identity, as a reminder to themselves of who they were and what they stood for. Now, if you decide, and maybe you do, maybe you need to have some of these thoughts and discussions and decisions in your family. If you decide in good faith, that you can't continue to watch that show or listen to that music or do business with this company or follow this social media account, then just don't. Just stop doing those things. You don't need to make a big stink about it. That's probably not going to provide the kind of witness to Jesus that is going to be helpful anyhow. Just don't do the thing anymore. And when you don't do the thing, let that be a reminder to yourself and to your family of just one small area where you're doing something in order to maintain your identity as the people of God. Number 4, finally, do whatever you do with excellence. This gets tricky because some people are going to believe, it's best to stay within a corrupt system and continue to be a light there, even if you can't affect widespread change. Others are going to be convicted that the best thing to do is just to get out. And that's hard. Christians are going to have to rely on God's wisdom to decide, where they stay, where they go. For example, this is just one example, but how they continue to practice medicine in a world of abortion and medically assisted dying and gender transition therapy, or whether they don't go into medicine anymore. That's just one example. And there aren't easy answers to be had. And we're going to see this again as we go throughout the book of Daniel. But wherever you are and whatever you do, don't give anybody an excuse to think that Christians are lazy or incompetent. If you work in a trade, work at that with all the skill and excellence and integrity and fair dealing that the Lord gives you. If you manage, then manage with honesty and compassion and care for your people. If you work in a service industry, be a blessing to those you come in contact with. Work hard throughout the day and see it as an opportunity to bear witness and bring the love and presence of Jesus with you. So take some time this week. Maybe consider a few of these things for yourself, your family, within the small group that you meet. Take the opportunity to find some ways that you can maintain your identity as believers. Not necessarily in a loud, vocal way, maybe not in a public way at all, but in a way that serves as an ongoing reminder to you, that reminds you that you are a person of faith. You are one of God's people. That's where your identity primarily lies. So let's just close with returning one last time to that theme of God gave. God gave his people over into some hard times. That sort of thing has happened before. It seems like, given the cultural moment we find ourselves in, it's happening again. I mean, we've been through this kind of small e exile, if you will, because of COVID, and we're kind of starting to get to the point where we're maybe going to come out of that soon. We're kind of in a big e exile moment too, because I mean, more and more it would seem our larger culture is tilting away from a lot of the things that believing and practicing Christians hold to be true. Even so, God also gave his people favor in that time. We saw this clearly in the text today. Remarkable favor God gave them, and remarkable wisdom. I just love how those two went together in this passage, where God gave them favor, and yet he also gave them the wisdom to work that out and figure out how they should live. And we saw that in that wonderful quick negotiating that Daniel had to do. And I think that's a remarkable pattern for us to follow and figure out how we live in this time. And so as we go, remember, God remained sovereign then, even in what Daniel and his friends went through. And God remains sovereign now in whatever we're going through. Amen.